evening. Welcome to the Boston Public Library. My name is Rebecca Campbell. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping details to share. Please take a moment and silence anything that beeps and buzzes. Following tonight's discussion, a book signing will take place in the Trident Bookstore. It is in the back of the room. And on your way out, please be sure to pick up a program brochure. Tonight's program is part of the Revolutionary Boston, a citywide commemoration. And we have a very robust selection of programming taking place in support of the exhibition. Throughout their 54-year marriage, John and Abigail Adams enjoyed a diverse cuisine in both Massachusetts and Europe. The Culinary Lives of John and Abigail Adams features traditional New England recipes as well as dishes from published cookbooks settlers brought from the Old World. Author Rosana Wan is a park ranger of the Adams National Historical Park, a sergeant in the Army National Guard, and the first recipient of the John C. Kavanagh Prize in History at Suffolk University. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Rosana Wan.
Thank you, Rebecca, for this short intro about my life. And thank you for having me. Tonight, it is my pleasure to discuss the culinary tastes and experiences of John and Abigail Adams, which is the subject of my book. My completion of this book is tied to my personal journey to become a historian, and with my growing understanding that the history of food is central to American social and political history. I will begin by discussing how I came to write this book, and then I will share the results of my research with you. This book originated in my undergraduate studies at Suffolk University. During my senior year, I took a course on 18th century America called The Age of Franklin. My instructor, Professor Barbara Allison, who is also the author of several different books about Boston history and American Revolution, and he is also the chair of the history department at Suffolk. He had his students completed a research project on anything they chose. Instead of researching a topic in 18th century colonial American history, I decided to do something different. I chose to complete a research project on Julia Child because I wanted to understand how her passion for French cuisine led to her career as a cooking teacher. And I also want to find out why her famous words, bon appetit, were so appealing to the American audience. By reading her memoir, My Life in France, and cooking from her first book, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, I was able to explore cooking in my own way, while guided by her words. Little did I know that studying Julia Child would lead me to research the culinary lives of John and Abigail Adams. My study of Julia Child's career would lead me to recall a memory of dining upon 18th century dishes at the City Tavern in Philadelphia. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of eating at the Tavern, you should know that it specialized in 18th century American cuisine. While there, I purchased a copy of the City Tavern Cookbook by Walter Stabb. And while in Professor Allison's class, I decided to make a period goods, baked goods, from the cookbook for the history department. And one of these treats was sweet potato biscuits, right here, ta-da, which happens to be Thomas Jefferson's favorites. And around this time, I noticed that many cookbooks that featured food items consumed by the founding fathers and mothers, especially the obvious ones like Jefferson, George and Martha Washington, but it did not include the foodways of John and Abigail Adams. I wonder why and decided to find out in my own terms. Shortly after I graduated from Suffolk University, I took a pilgrimage to the Adams homestead in Quincy, Massachusetts, in order to search for an answer to my questions. I asked park rangers at the site about what kind of dishes would they have enjoyed, but none of the staff would give me a specific answer. All they said was New England cuisine. I then decided to reread one of my favorite books for further information. One of them was David McCullough's John Adams, which I cherished throughout high school and in my undergraduate years. McCullough's study offered a small insight into the diet of John and Abigail Adams, including their love of many foods, not just plum pudding and mince pies. And almost immediately, I had the idea of integrating the history of 18th century American cuisine with the story of John and Abigail Adams. I immediately decided to take on this project just for fun, to practice my historical thinking skills and prepare for graduate work. My historical culinary adventure, in quote, as I call it, was born. During this research, I discovered that John and Abigail left us an unusual gift, specifically their views of the food world, which can be found in an extraordinary collection of their correspondence, letters to contemporaries, and diary entries. It was not only because they were open about themselves or opinionated about others. It was food that portrayed who these people were. Not only defined the love that they shared during the 54 years of their marriage. They also brought a perspective on how certain food items like seafood, tea, and sugar were some of the leading causes of the American Revolution. How their food, which shaped the future United States. As I read the cookbooks published during their lifetime, and their writing that housed at the Massachusetts Historical Society, I envisioned them at a dining table, like this one that was purchased by Abigail when she was in Europe for their new home at Peacefield, that they would be discussing about the garden that they tended at Peacefield, or even the types of produce were sold at the market, and also imagining what would they have eaten or what would they have drank. By weaving these two very different topics together, my research led me to recall the words of another student of American history, who once remarked on the Adams family. Tremendous devotion to the public interest. This vitality which goes from generation to generation down to the present is really the most exceptional scarlet thread which runs throughout the entire tapestry of American political life. And this was said by our 35th president, John F. Kennedy. And I believe that the scarlet thread that Kennedy was referring to was food, connecting us, and of course these two people, and most of all, our history. And in order to fully understand them, we must not only read secondary sources about them, or the correspondence, or even publication written about them. But we must eat like them. Clues to their diet are evident in their writing while living at home or on the road in America and Europe. The Adams accounts of their cuisine and their notes about European dining culture and customs gave us a more complete picture of the American Revolution and the founding of the U.S. And these accounts also give us an insight into the intimate part of John and Abigail Adams, who often reported their food observations to one another as one. This was true regardless whether Abigail was having tea with Martha Washington, or even John Adams had turkey with a group of French naval officers in Europe. Again, their food observations were contributed as one. When we look at their lives, we discover they live in what some historians have called a generation of avid readers and opinionated minds. I've learned that it was also a generation of tavern goers and a generation of food critics. Taverns were some of the most debated places in John's early career as a lawyer. Although these ordinary places were mostly served as a pit stop to accommodate weary travelers, or serve as a coffee shop, a post office, discuss the news of the day, or even share rumors, gossips. But these taverns, or licensed houses, as John Adams called, were also a hot topic by itself. European paintings and engravings like A Midnight Modern Conversation, circa 1792 by William Hogarth, it helped us to understand the tavern culture, both good and bad. Although Hogarth had never set his foot in America, but he had his opinions on intemperance and other 7 deadly sins. Yes, and I don't need to recite those. By exaggerating the behavior of these disordered conduct and over drinking, and he depicted the stages of drunkenness, from having the first drink to passing out. But in the hindsight, his satirical view of the tavern culture was also criticizing the American lifestyle here in British colonial America, that they did not act as proper as the English, instead as fake, low-life, savages. And like his views on the taverns, the tavern life, John Adams also had his own share of these low-life licensed houses. And almost 30 years after Hogarth's painting, the road to the American Revolution was just underway. And young John Adams was just as ambitious and a successful lawyer, but he was brought up with a puritanical mind. He descended from a family of Puritans in Braintree. There were many before him in Boston that had already spoke critically on the purpose of these licensed houses. Harvard College president Increase Mather once spoke about drinking in moderation, that a drink is in itself a good creature of God, but he warned that the abuse of drink is from Satan. For the college that trains ministers, Mather installed strict laws on limits of drinking for the campus. His son, Todd Mather, another Harvard alum, also noted that by 1675, every other building in Boston is an ale house. And like the Mathers or Hogarth's work, John Adams had criticized these licensed houses in a similar form. He drew this, a map of Braintree and Weymouth that had surrounded by numerous taverns built over one on top of the other. And by the time he had drawn this map, the rums have already widely produced from distilled fermented molasses. Hops were cultivated throughout Massachusetts area in order to produce ale. And apples could be pressed to produce hard cider, which happens to be one of John Adams' favorite drinks. And while fulfilling his duties, Adams also wrote an essay in his diary about the evils of licensed houses. Written in the May 29, 1760, he condemned the culture of these places and its lucrativeness. He wrote critically about how young people were being idleness, wasting their fortunes and time in taverns, and end up in homeless and even in jail. But he did not agree that there was no regulation in supply of liquor. But he also found these places, as the reputation of our country is ruined among strangers who are apt to invert the character of a place from that of the taverns and the people they see there. But the worst effect of all, and which ought to make every man who has the least sense of his privileges tremble, these houses are becoming, in many places, the nurseries of our legislators. You see where I'm going with this, about how food goes into politics? And in fact, by the next decade of 1770s, John Adams will witness these public houses were no longer considered as sinful places. Not so much of a puritanical perspective anymore. One historian, Gavin Nathan, will call it these places by 1770s as an institution. But John Adams would see these places as safe havens for advocating and planning boycotts against the king, distributing anti-Tory pamphlets, and promoting independence from Great Britain. These places also hosted secret groups of patriots, including the Sons of Liberty, delegates of the Continental Congress. Some of these places were held miniature version of tea parties as a way to boycott the Tea Act. But John Adams' dining experience at these places had also sharpened his political ideas. A newspaper and print from England would make mockeries about American complaints in the colonies, like this one, for example, showing a group of patriotic ladies or a female Congress at Edmonton in North Carolina signing a petition and not drinking tea. But one little intimate side from John Adams was that in the summer of 1774, he was in Falmouth, what is now Portland in Maine, and he was so impressed by this wife of a proprietor at the tavern who insisted on serving him coffee instead of tea. She explained to John Adams that she and her husband have renounced all tea in this place. John described that incident in a letter to his wife, Abigail, in which he added that tea must be universally renounced. It must be weaned, and the sooner the better. So we can see that his observations about these places and also the unwritten part of the culture. But these simple food items like tea and the attitudes from the American side are the roots of the American Revolution. But on the other side of this lesser evil note about these licensed houses, John will record as a delegate of Continental Congress that these places were more served as a hospitality for weary traveler like himself. On some occasions, when he was traveling in mid-November of 1777 to Dutchess County in New York, and this is what he wrote on the 17th. A decent grace before and after meal, fine pork and beef and cabbage and turnip. The next day, he went to another tavern, and he was dining with Dr. Sam Adams, Dr. Hostess, Mr. Wells, and many others, and he wrote, it was a feast, salt pork and cabbage, roast beef and potatoes, and a noble soup pudding, grog, and a glass of port. And by reading these small tidbits from his diary, we could get a snapshot of him as a traveler and a food observer, making numerous pit stops, held meetings, discussed politics. And although many of these places were demolished over the centuries, replaced by factories, tenement houses, and modern-day office buildings, but some of them still exist. And in fact, some of them, especially when you walk around Boston, you'll find simple and small tablets displayed on a modern-day building, showing a site where a particular tavern would have been located. But there are also some that still function as a restaurant. And some of them function as a museum by itself. And some, like Francis Tavern in New York City, serve as both. When I was revisiting the City Tavern in Philadelphia, I did not know John Adams' better half, Abigail Adams, had dined there once when she was the hostess of the Vice President, John Adams. And by reading the letters which she wrote on what she ate, I discovered that she was as opinionated and observant as her counterpart. Because she was no ordinary wife, we must not simply look at her as the wife of John Adams. We must look at her as a well-bred cook. She was often surrounded by men of great minds, not just the one from her family, like brother-in-law Richard Crange, or even her father, Reverend William Smith, but also contemporaries like Benjamin Franklin, and even her friends like Dr. Benjamin Rush, Thomas Jefferson, and even General Horatio Gates, or John Jay from New York. But when she was in Europe, she had opportunities to watch live performance of Shakespeare place. That was some of her favorite readings. And also attended art museums, and even attended a French play in Paris, which would later turn into an opera by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Le Noces de Figaro, or in English, The Marriage of Figaro. It is very possible that none of her receipts or recipes survive as a food researcher. I had to repaint her culinary portrait. By studying cookbooks published during her lifetime, like this one by Eliza Smith, The Complete Housewife, and also look at the contemporary handwritten recipes at institutions like the Massachusetts Historical Society. I turned out to be a collective as a researcher, and I almost resembled to a book collector, John Adams. And in fact, his book collection is here at the Boston Public Library at Copley Square. And one of the things that attracted me about Abigail was strawberries. And I did not learn about strawberries that has a rich connection with Massachusetts State, and later turned into a popular fruit or even a snack until I got involved with this Adams Cookbook project. And I had no idea how delicate strawberries can be until I read Abigail's correspondence. Her notions of strawberries provided us an intimate part of this dynamic family life. In June of 1776, while visiting her friend in Plymouth, very possible Mercy Otis Warren, she wrote a letter to John about her anxieties on traveling alone with her sister, Betty, or Elizabeth, and reporting about seeing the Continental soldiers were strengthening the Boston Harbor, including Paddocks and Long Island. And those two islands, you can actually go there today, and they are part of the Boston Harbor Islands, a national recreation area. There were camps, gun batteries that were set on these islands, surrounded the great town of Boston, which was occupied by the British just before their departure earlier in March. And outside of the news about family and politics, she wrote about how extreme weather has affected their crops, including strawberries. You mention your peas, your cherries, your strawberries, and etc. Ours are but just in blossom. We have had the coldest spring I ever knew. Things are 3 weeks back of what they generally used to be. The corn looks poor. The season now is rather dry. And in fact, a few weeks before she wrote this letter to John Adams also said a similar thing. Yesterday, I dined with Captain Richards, the gentleman who made me the present of brass pistols. We have cherries, strawberries, and green peas in plenty. The fruits are 3 weeks earlier here than with you. Indeed, they are a fortnight earlier on the east than on the west side of the Delaware River. We have had peas this week past, but they were brought over the river from New Jersey to this market. There are none grown in the city or on the west side of the river yet. The reason is the soil of New Jersey is a warm sand, that of Pennsylvania a cold clay. So much for the peas and berries. As we examined this dialogue, we found that John and Abigail were simply not only they discussed the extreme weather that were affecting their strawberries, but they were concerned on their well-being. They were affected by war. These were powerful statements in their own ways. As a food researcher, I found these strawberries brought a different perspective into their personal lives. And we could see how strawberries were widely loved by this couple, because long after they became grandparents, strawberries still played a large role in their lives. And if you imagine Grandma Abigail would write to Mary Smith Crange, her older sister, that she preferred to have one in particular hire hands to help her pick strawberries than the other. And this is what she wrote. And my strawberry bed student must intend to very soon in the spring. I should not, like any other person, should touch it. Very demanding, right? And while grandfather John Adams would later wrote to his son, John Quincy, about his grandsons, George Washington, John Adams II, and of course Charles Francis Adams, were picking strawberries from his garden and eat them. And we could use these snapshots to help us interpret how strawberries were prepared. Either served as fresh fruits, or serve them, or stew them, or even turn them into strawberry puree, or strawberry fool. And even the future America's first professional still life painter from Philadelphia, Raphael Peale, whose father, Charles Wilson Peale, had met John Adams when they were young, contemporaries of American Revolution, painted a still life of strawberries sitting in a jug of water, jug dispenser. And on the other hand, I'd like to share with you is that eating utensils, dining wares, and even this crystal ball right here were some of the many things that the Adams had purchased when they were in Europe. And of course, half of them are second-handed. But this bowl does not simply serve as a punch bowl, but I think it defined her personal work, how she transformed herself from a typical New England housewife to a hostess, or even a caretaker of a president, borrowing customs and inheriting duties from their first lady, Martha Washington. Abigail expected that she would not have a quiet life like she wished when she and John Adams returned from Europe in 1788. But for one occasion, as the First Lady, she has to give instructions back at home. And one notes to Mary Smith Crange that punch must be made by gallons. You will procure spirit for the purpose, and in a box in a north cellar, which is nailed up in some Jamaica spirit, that with some brandy will answer. By the end of their lives, many would have visited the old patriot, a matriarch, for one last time. But Abigail will continue to work as a well-bred cook, despite illnesses and rheumatism that took her health. But she will write notes to family members like this one, to her to daughter-in-law, Nancy Harold Adams, in 1806, to request some chocolate for the household. But some visitors, like an English traveler and surgeon, Henry Bradshaw Farron, would take home with him some ideas of the culinary lives of John and Abigail Adams. And later, he writes in this book that he published that as the table of a late king may be amusing, take the following particulars. First course, a pudding made of Indian corn, molasses, and butter. Second, veal, bacon, neck of mutton, potatoes, cabbages, carrots, and Indian beans. Madeira wine, of which each drank 2 glasses. We sat down to dinner at 1 o'clock. At 2, nearly all went a second time to church. For tea, we had pound cake, wheat bread and butter, and bread made of Indian corn and rye, similar to our brown homemade. And we could not fully understand the lives of these people unless we examine what they ate and about food preparations and consumption. And likewise, research on social history of food enable us to understand the importance of generations of presidents and first ladies who introduced new dining customs to the White House. And writing this book deepens my appreciation of this extraordinary couple, their hard work, their sacrifice of personal happiness for this new nation, and without the importance of their role in American Revolution, the establishment of the United States would have been a different outcome. And when we walk through the Freedom Trail in downtown Boston, there is actually a piece of John or Abigail Adams near each site. In some ways, it could trace us back to their home at Peacefield, or even their cottage, as they call it, what is now John Quincy Adams' birthplace. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
When John and Abigail arrived in France, did they talk at all about the difference in the food? Or
They at first they complained, just like any foreign travelers. Why is it not like what we are used to back at home? But for Abigail especially, she had to adapt this new lifestyle of having a household of servants. So the servants help her do a lot of the work that she would have done on her own if she was by herself. John Adams, on the other hand, though, he wrote some of the dishes he had when he was in Europe. So he was also served as a pretty good observer about what was being served over in France or any parts like England, for example.
he went to Holland too, right?
Yes, he was also in Holland too, exactly. Any questions? I know you guys are hungry. I can't make any food. There's no hot plates right here. Yes, sir.
When he wrote these letters commenting on the food, do you think he was particularly interested in food, or because he was obviously a proficient correspondent, do you think he was just relating to his wife or other people what he was, like his experience of the day, but not something he particularly took a real interest in?
That's a wonderful question. Someone had asked me this before, that in my opinion, he did a little bit of both. As a food observer, telling his wife what's going on when about his job. Sometimes he found something very interesting. In fact, for instance, when he was in France, there was one time he was having a dinner with a group of French naval officers on a ship. And the story goes, there was the turkey was brought on a table. And then one of the French officer leaned over and asked him, "What is that?" And he said that it's a turkey. And remember, this was not a diary entry. It was an autobiography that John Adams barely started it, and he elaborated the whole entire history of Turkey. And so, for me as a food researcher, a budding historian, and I just find it fascinating. It was a pretty good history lesson for me. Yes?
When Abigail became First Lady, did you get the impression she was trying to copy Martha Washington or trying to put her own stamp on the role of First Lady?
When Abigail became the First Lady, I believe she wanted to be more on her own terms. Because back when she was the hostess for Vice President Adams, she got very tired of the Washingtons serving tea parties and tea and cake and punch over and over again very frequently. And by the time she became the First Lady, not only she was often very ill, but also have a lot of concerns in her mind about her grown children. As some of you may be aware that by the time she became the First Lady, her oldest daughter, Nabby, who the family would call her Nabby, her husband had already left and looked for jobs for a number of years, and so she was very concerned about her own daughter and, of course, their children. And also, on the other hand, her middle son, Charles Adams, who soon, by 1800, by the end of John Adams' term, would died of alcoholism. So there was a lot on her mind all the time. And when I was reading her letters, especially to her sister, she opened up more towards her sister, which is a common thing between siblings, a very beautiful thing, is that she was just tired, just weary, wasn't too interested in hosting tea parties, dinner parties. So I think she was more of an intimate person. She wanted to be she would prefer to have a quiet life than versus having parties, fanfares like the future Dolly Madison. Yes, sir.
I think it was Jefferson, when he was president, had a cook that was actually one of his slaves, I think, whom he
Yes.
had trained in
Yes, that was James Hemings.
France.
Yeah.
And, the brother of Stalin. Anyway, so he, I think, tried to introduce the European cuisine.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just curious, obviously, Abigail and John was in Europe a lot. When she was First Lady, did she have European or American or any particular?
I think once she and her husband had been in Europe, they were influenced by the dining customs. In fact, they bought dinner plates, chinas, which you can still see it today when you take a tour of Peacefield. These were second-hand items, but they would use it over and over again when John Adams took office as vice president and, of course, president. So the dining customs, they brought it with them back to their new roles in Philadelphia and also in New York and eventually Washington.